It's been an exciting 10 years. We began in an apartment near the University of Toronto, owned by the late Chris Kobrak. And at that first meeting, there was Chris, who obviously is not here today. There was Dimitri Anastaskas, who succeeded him as chair of Canadian Business History. Dimitri, where are you? Is he? Oh, there he is. And Dimitri will be next summer chairing the first International Business History Conference held in North America. Andrew Ross, sitting in front of me, is succeeded Dimitri as our chair after we got going just recently. And I mustn't forget anyone on the list. I think that's just about it. And there was a chap, there was myself and one other chap and by the name of Mark Bonham. Now, if you go to our website, cbha.ca, you will see that our mission is dedicated to advancing the study, preservation, and promotion of business history. Thank you. In the first decade of our existence, we have contributed. We have removed business history from being the lacuna of Canadian history. But we must go further. I hope that you will see fit to join us in trying to make business history as relevant as is political history and social history and military history. We've done a number of other things: money for students, creating a website, hosting CBH talks, publishing a newsletter called Prospectus, and regular business history conferences. But this year, this fiscal year, we initiated something new, and that was these many business conferences which permitted business people to attend without cutting in too much of their busy day. So we are pleased to be here in the business capital. And I'd like to thank those of you, our members, who have helped make what we've achieved so far possible. I guess he's not a patron saint, but he's close to it. Red Wilson, who most of you know, phoned me one day at the cottage and said, Joe, I'm going to give you $1 million for the CBHA. I stuttered and stammered, and he said, I haven't finished. And I said, okay, what's else? He said, and if you can match it, I'll give you another $1 million. And with that, we matched it. Many thanks to people like Rick Waugh, John Cleghorn, the former CEO of the Royal Bank, my good friend Anonymous, and also another good friend from Oxford, Nova Scotia, the Blueberry King of Canada, John Bragg. And many of you here contributed to that and has helped make possible what we've achieved. In addition, over the past decade, we've had a number of corporate sponsors, and my eyesight is going, but I think somewhere Jeremy Mosher is here from the National Bank. There he is. They were one of the first. And in addition to that sponsor, we have Rob Richards, chairman of Heathbridge Capital, who's done so much not only to help us, but other history-oriented organizations. A good number of our board members are here, and if I can remember them all, point them out to you. I've already mentioned Ryan, I've mentioned Dimitri, I've mentioned Andrew, I've mentioned Jeremy. Where is Sanjeev? Sanjeev Kumar from TD Bank, and a special mention to Mona Chang. There she is in the front row. Not only is she a board member, she is a sponsor, and she has provided us with a great deal of assistance, and she has brought with her 20 guests, which is, so I'd like people to join hands and thank. So that's about us. Although I think it would be, I cannot pass on without saying a sponsor who is not here is Tony Fell, a legendary figure on Bay Street. Now let's next go to the distinguished panel. For the past 20 years, I have been immersed in Canadian business history at the Rotman School. In 1995, I had taken leave from a management consulting practice to join the school as an adjunct professor and executive in residence. The dot-com boom, some of you will remember, began in the late 90s, but then there was the crash in the early part of the century. I was chairman of a data mining company at the time, as well as teaching at Rotman, and suddenly my newfound wealth, which was not great, didn't last very long. I was very angry with myself, no one else, not being able to foresee a bubble. So I went to the Rotman Dean, Roger Martin, and I said to him that we were doing great things for students, but I felt that we were not giving them context, which I think any senior business leader needs. And Roger said, okay, Joe, that's a great idea. Why don't you go out and raise $3 million and we'll do that. I will tell you that it was the easiest $3 million I've ever raised. 5 individuals, and to give, you had to give at least $500,000. And that was no problem at all. We made one exception to our rule, and we allowed one gift for $50,000 US, and that was from the Dean of the Harvard Business School, John MacArthur. So right from the start, the chair was well funded. As the founding director of that program, I learned very quickly that there was very little written about financial history in Canada, and what was written was often ignored. Next, I discovered this Stern School at NYU, and they had a concept called the diamond model, using a baseball diamond, home plate, first base, second base, third base. And at home plate, you needed all those being healthy and doing the right thing to have a successful economy. And the home plate was where government is. Government makes the rules. The rest of us have to follow. First base was the financial system. And I don't know if I'd ever seen a place quite that way. There have been some very good books on Canadian business history. I think of Michael Bliss in particular, but I don't think I'd ever seen one which placed financial history at the center. And I thought that was very important. So from there, led me to Alfred Chandler, the distinguished founder of business history, and he laid down 3 rules for talking to a group like yours. The first rule is that I should start at the end of my paper and share that with you, which is a little unusual, but I think you'll get the logic later, and then move to the narrative and then have a conclusion. So in 15 minutes or less, I'm going to tell you what happened between the past and the legislative approval, which allowed financial institutions to acquire investment dealers. For Canada, the 1980s, I think a number of you are old enough to remember that, was a terrible decade. It was the worst decade since the dirty 30s. The Canadian banking system, long recognized as one of the best banking systems in the world, had some great difficulties. This was partially because of a significant shift in assets from Canada to international and Canada, particularly LDCs. But there was also domestically a problem, and while I'm sure you will all remember the two Alberta banks, Hal Jackman is often fond of reminding me that they weren't alone. There was also Mercantile, there was the Bank of British Columbia, and there was the Continental. Supreme Court Justice Willard Estey was called in to get his opinion, and his key recommendation was the creation of the Office of Superintendent of Financial Institutions, OSFI. So that was sort of the situation when the various governments got together to allow other financial institutions to buy investment dealers. I'm going to take you back to the beginning. And when the fathers of Confederation met in Charlottetown and in Quebec City and in London, England, there was no doubt that banking, incorporation of banks, and the issue of paper money would be a federal authority. There was no doubt at any time. In fact, as early as 1858, that had already been communicated to the authorities in the United Kingdom. We can thank, I think, Alexander Tellegalt, probably more than any other person, for his hard work in making the founding fathers come up with that sensible recommendation of Section 9113. Along with Galt, there was, of course, Sir Johnny MacDonald, who had experience in banking, Samuel Leonard Tilley from New Brunswick, and Alexander Hamilton also played a role. Now, your eyebrows may have arched when I mentioned Alexander Hamilton, but Johnny MacDonald had a copy of the secret proceedings from the conference in Philadelphia in 1787, and there were a list of concerns in that document. So further proof of Hamilton's role is when the Bank of Montreal was created in 1817, not when it was chartered, but 5 years before when it was created. It was a direct copy of the first Bank of the United States, which Hamilton had written. Hamilton's influence in Canadian banking was settled by Adam Short in the late 19th century and was reinforced in 1986 when Bob McIntosh, who I know some of you here remember, had what he wrote pulled into this book. And Bob, as you know, in addition to being a highly effective executive director of CBA, had a deep and passionate interest in history. This is what Short wrote in the late 19th century. The father of the Canadian banking system was Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury. The subsequent history of Canadian banking shows clearly that these ideas were permanently adopted. I think it is safe to say that Alexander Hamilton was in the rooms, not the room, the rooms where it happened with John A. et al. In Province House in Charlottetown and in the building on Côte de la Montagne in Quebec City and in the Westminster Lecture Hall in London, England. If you haven't noticed, there are copies of Wall Street to Bay Street. I guess they're in here, so you'll see them later. in both English and in Mandarin. And I think we have set up now, when you go out, you might want to look because we're running on the TV, a documentary that PBS ran for 2 different years on the book. They took the book and the documentary was based on that. So moving to the body of my talk, most Canadian historians have ignored Hamilton's influence on the Canadian banking system, but not American authors such as Bray Hamilton, one of the most distinguished. I have a question for you about Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton, for you. It has been a great international hit. Why have Canadians been so disinterested in Hamilton's role in shaping our banking system? My wife and I certainly were. We paid $1,600 for 2 seats in the last row, upper balcony in New York to see it, and it was well worth seeing even at that price. They saw but in addition to the people I've already mentioned, Galt, Tilley, and John A., all of the fathers of Confederation deserve credit for putting banking and currency in Section 9113. They saw the financial chaos in the United States, specifically when Andrew Jackson became president, destroyed the second bank of the United States, destroyed Hamiltonian system in the United States, and issued the 1836 Specie Circular, which resulted in 25% of the banks in the United States going under. Then they saw it not that long after, when in the war between the states. At one point in that war, you could purchase an American dollar for 32 cents Canadian. Not a good model to follow. So on the way to Confederation, we should also not forget the abrogation of the 1854 Reciprocity Treaty. There was a nasty spirit at play in the United States, and they wanted to destroy the free trade agreement, thinking that it would bring Canada to its knees, and if it was on its knees, it would fall into America's lap. But John A. and Joseph Cartier persisted, and in the United Kingdom, the Earl of Derby, who was succeeded by Disraeli, were both supporters of the Canadian colonies. So as you can tell, I think there needs to be greater recognition of what an incredibly positive role Section 9113 has had. We were the first federation in the world where the federal government was given control over banking. I'm not going to cite any authorities here, but think for a minute, maybe at home tonight. Can you imagine what Canada would be like if banking and the currency were given to the provinces rather than the federal authority? I know it's hard to imagine, but that was a possibility, and those old guys somehow did the right thing. Once the new federal government had power over banking, what kind of bank act would they pass? After all, the United States Congress had not renewed the first bank, and Jackson had killed the second. Well, the passage of the Bank Act of 1871 was another great achievement, not generally recognized in our country. I can remember I had an article published in Financial History on Wall Street on the 150th occasion of that event. I saw nothing in any Canadian media. Galt, who up until this point in Canadian history had been a hero, he had problems once the new country was created as our first Minister of Finance. Amongst other things, he was shareholder of the Commercial Bank of the Midland District, one of the two large banks in what is now the province of Ontario. And when first the Bank of Upper Canada in 1866 and then the Commercial Bank of the Midland District the following year went down, Galt, Minister of Finance, said the government should support a bailout. His colleagues did not agree, and he resigned. At least some people say he resigned, many say he was pushed. So what happened? You've got a brand new country. What does the Prime Minister do? He turned to one of his best friends, John Rose, later Sir John, in Montreal, a very prominent business figure in Montreal, and he asked him to fill that role. Rose, very competent, quickly produced a Bank Act, which could have been written by the CEO of the Bank of Montreal, who some bankers may recall their history was the most popular CEO of any bank in the history of the country, so that did not go down well with the average citizen. So there we are, a little over 2 years into a new country, and we haven't a Minister of Finance. So Sir Francis Hincks had recently retired as a governor of the West Indies, and he brought Hincks in and created one of the finest bank acts ever, and it was admired at the time. Some of its, I'm going to talk about just a few of its characteristics and then focus on the big one. He demanded minimum capitalization, double liability for shareholders, total liabilities of the bank not to exceed 3 times capital, and he got around the battle, which was a huge thing at the time, is whether the private sector or the public sector would be responsible for issuing currency, and he introduced dual currency. But the most important thing of all is he brought in a provision that said every decade the Bank Act will be reviewed. Now, that may not sound like a big deal to you, but think of it. Mandated periodic revision, and the revision period should be free from political interference. That's a powerful statement. The legislation passed was noted by Roger Martin, the former dean of the Rotman Business School, 5 years ago in his book, Where More Is Not Better. And he recommended that this provision in the Canadian Bank Act be applied to all legislation. And he said, why? Because there is no such thing as perfection in a complex adaptive world. The solution is to ensure periodic reassessments are written into legislation. Canada's unprecedented review process has been a strength and has been in place more than a century and a half. In some cases, the reviews have dealt with specific problems and others with longer-term issues. If you're a student of banking history in the country, we had the home bank failure in the 20s, and that certainly resulted in a Bank Act review and a recommendation that from the 20s onwards that there would be a superintendent of banking, which for the early years there was no federal regulation of the banking system. My first encounter with the review process is when the Porter Commission was holding their hearings in the 1960s, and I had the pleasure of working on the Manitoba submission, and that report was highly regarded because it loosened the straitjacket of the banks. In 1992, the reviews were switched from decennial to quinquennial, and the next is scheduled for June next year. Personally, I am not sufficiently knowledgeable to say what the impact of the creation of OSFI has on the review process, and I will leave that to the panel. To this point, I have focused on banking and the relationship between the government and the banking system. My main conclusion is that I am confident that the panelists are much more qualified than I am to discuss the reasons for giving financial institutions permission to acquire investment dealers. Let me give you just a few brief historical perspectives. From the beginning of the Dominion of Canada, there were 4 pillars: banking, trust companies, insurance companies, and investment dealers. And the investment dealers were covered under Section 9213 of the BNA Act, which allocates property and civil rights to the provinces. If you go back in history, that particular phrase, property and civil rights, goes all the way back to the Act of 1874, the Quebec Act, and was brought forward from there. I'd love to tell you my first experience in my first job of dealing with the various houses. It was really delightful to be taken to the best restaurants in town when you're on the buy side. Coming forward to the present, you'll remember that there was a series of regulatory changes between 86 and 87. The reviews allowed the banks, the insurance companies, the trust companies to enter into the securities business. We all know that the 1987 Little Bang was nowhere as big as Maggie Thatcher's Big Bang, but it did begin the process of breaking down the pillars, and we look forward to what the panel has to say on this matter.